Tony Hill is one of the most successful players in Cowboys history. He helped lead the Cowboys to 5 conference championship games in 6 years. He was explosive, clutch.
Tony Hill. Tony Hill will score for Dallas.
A deep threat assassin.
Staubach faces a blitz and has time and goes deep for Tony Hill and got him. Touchdown Dallas.
And arguably the most talented receiver of those late 70s and early 80s teams. But just how good was he when we evaluate his career? In this video, I will do the most extensive research on Hill's career that you ever seen. This video is going to shock some of you. What you thought you knew about Hill is going to change. Hill was selected out of Stanford in 1977 in the 3rd round and immediately made an impact on special teams. But outside of a few punts and kickoff returns, he hardly had playing time. It wasn't until the next season that Hill caught the league by storm. He had 823 yards and 6 touchdowns, which was 12th in the league. Not impressive, right? Well, those numbers are inflated. I'll prove it to you. Notice how Hill had 46 receptions that season. That was 28th in the league. 28th? Yup, 28. So I decided to research the top 28 receivers and receptions in 1978. And I was shocked. If we're just measuring Hill's valued production based on the opportunities that were given to him, he had over 800 yards with under 50 receptions. The only receivers who had more or similar yards based on receptions were Wesley Walker, Reggie Rucker, Mill Gray, Stanley Morgan, John Stallworth, and James Lofton. Based on Hill's yards per reception that season, if he had caught just 12 or more receptions, that would have been enough for at least 4th in the league in yards that season, in just his first season starting. But of course, he had to share with the legend Drew Pearson, who didn't have a bad season that year either. Now keep in mind, whenever I do these videos, I always look at value over stats. And here's what I mean. Sometimes raw stats can be inflated. A receiver can have a lot of yards because of a high number of targets or catches. On the other hand, sometimes a receiver can be unstoppable where the offense will just feed their guy over and over again during the season. So there will always be an argument on yards manipulation with receivers who have high target seasons. But here's where it's almost always inflated. When a receiver has a lot of yards on a few receptions, most likely, as I said before, receivers who have a lot of targets will generally have a lot of yards. But rarely do you ever see someone have low receptions but have a lot of yards, unless their production is elite too. For example, other than the ones that I already mentioned, I looked up receivers in 1978 who had catches ranging from 40 to 49. PFR counted 24 players. None of them had over 800 yards. This proves 2 of my points. 1, receivers with low catches will typically have low yards. 2, Tony Hill's production or receptions had elite value, more than those receivers with a high number of targets and yards.
Motion, number 88. Staubach, play action fake. Looking for Tony Hill, he's wide open. Touchdown. 6 points, Tony Hill. Boy. Staubach puts one up in the direction of Tony Hill. This should be 6. Tony Hill's 2nd touchdown of the night.
How do you like that?
9th of the season. And it comes from 75 yards out.
Excellence of the quarterback, the excellence of the receiver.
It's the 2nd time tonight that I've seen really a receiver wide open.
Receivers with a high amount of yards but low catches and targets most of the time mean one thing: he needs to be involved in the offense more because he is highly productive with fewer opportunities, which is exactly what happened the next season. In 1979, his receptions increased by 14, and just like we calculated the season prior, had Dallas given him at least 12 more receptions, he would have had a 1,000-yard season. Well, in 79, he had a 1,000-yard season because he did get those 12 or 14 receptions. Although PFR didn't calculate targets in the 70s or 80s, I think it's rational to believe that his yards and receptions increased because his targets increased. But here's what's interesting. His 60 receptions were outside of the top 10 just like the previous season. In fact, if we look at the top 10 receivers not counting Steve Largent, because he had a monster season that year on just 66 receptions, Drew Pearson had a monster year as well. Had Pearson caught just 10 more receptions, he could have easily been in the top 5 in yards that season. Outside of those receivers, the same could be applied to Hill. With more receptions, Hill would have had a top 5 receiver value as well for the 2nd season in a row.
The throw, he's a left-hander, wide open, Tony Hill, touchdown.
Hill picked up where he left off in the 1980 season.
17-0
the second quarter. 8 minutes, 19 seconds left to play in the second quarter. Long pass. Tony Hill. He's got a touchdown for Tony Hill.
For consecutive seasons, he had 1,000 yards, which was the first time that a Cowboys receiver did it since the days of Bob Hayes in the 60s. But again, among those receivers, he had the lowest receptions but the highest yards per reception. If you look at the value of his production compared to the rest of his peers, Hill was a top 5 receiver in football for the third straight season. He made the best out of what he was given. And in 1981, Hill was battling injuries that kept him out of 2 games and kept him from starting in 6 games.
Second down and 3. Flea flicker. There'll be a man wide open. Tony Hill.
Okay, there it is.
But ultimately, the same principle applied again. Outside of Stanley Morgan, Hill was the only receiver in the league with less than 50 receptions who had over 950 yards receiving. He was tied for 4th in the league in yards per reception, with 20 yards per catch.
19-10. 5:30 remaining in the second quarter. White up on top. Tony Hill wide open. Look out. Watch out. Tony Hill's gone. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. 63-yard touchdown pass on a third down situation.
Not much rush. You watch Tony Hill here. Made a good move. Caught the ball. And then Rod Perry runs by him.
Although I wouldn't put his production at a top 5 value that season, still, 950 yards on less than 50 receptions shows how dominant he was. In fact, from 1982 to 1984, he only played in 32 games and started in just 28. Those 32 games are a difference in a 2-season stretch. In those 32 games, Hill had a combined 2,191 yards, which was still pretty impressive. That's basically 2 seasons with an average of almost 1,100 yards. Although not as productive as his previous seasons, Hill has some of his best games in that stretch.
Ball inside the 25-yard line. Play action by Danny White. Looking for the bomb to Tony Hill, and he'll be there. This is going to be 6 points for Tony Hill, and that's what the Dallas Cowboys were looking for. They are explosive, and they can come back from the shotgun. Danny White going for Tony Hill. One hand grab. Touchdown, Dallas. About a step. Ball had to be right there. That is amazing.
In 85, Hill had his most successful season in terms of stats.
Second down, 4. Newsom in motion. Flag is down. Free play for White. Caught by Tony Hill. If the play stands, Tony Hill has now set a single season record of 74 catches. He breaks a tie he had with Ron Springs. And that also is the 59th consecutive game in which he has caught a pass, breaking a tie he held with Drew Pearson.
It was Landry's last year having a playoff team, and Hill was a huge factor in that success. Now, let's get into something really interesting. I came up with an idea. Hill's best season was over 111 games, starting from the first game of his first season as a starter in 1978, which was stretched to 1985. Those were his prime seasons. How many yards did he gain in that stretch? And if I decided to look up other receivers of that decade and era and research their first 111 games starting from their first season as a starter going deep into their prime, where would Hill stack up? What I found was shocking. If you go on any website, look for the top 5 receivers of the 80s. I'm pretty sure these receivers will most likely be in the top 5. So I researched each of these wide receivers' first 111 games, starting from their first season as a starter. One of the requirements that I had was that the player had to play at least 5 years in the 80s, since Tony Hill played the majority of his career in the 80s. So I went and researched Tony Hill's 111 games from 1978 to 1985, and I was shocked. It wasn't because I didn't believe that he was good. Obviously, he was a great receiver, but I didn't know he was this good. Hill had 7,197 receiving yards. But let's go further. Comparing receivers who played between 1980 to 1985, Hill was the only receiver to have 5,000 yards or more while having under 330 receptions in that period. Wow. Hill was one of the most efficient and explosive receivers to ever play. From the moment that he stepped onto the football field, Hill was a bona fide star. He ended his career as the all-time leader in receptions and yards in Cowboys history. Along with Michael Irvin, he was the only receiver on the franchise to lead their team in yards for 7 consecutive seasons. Hill is one of the most underrated receivers in the history of the Dallas Cowboys franchise. And if no one else is it, I will. Thank you, Tony Hill, for all of the memories. You will forever be a Cowboy legend. Until next time, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And as always, thanks for watching.